it's a pleasure to be here. This is my first time at the Raisina Dialogue, but not my first time in India. So great to be back in Delhi and great to be holding this session today. Our speakers have now been introduced. So let me just start by reminding you that the topic for today is uninterrupted peaks, rethinking energy access, affordability, and security. And I think it's fair to say, with the current political winds blowing, climate is out, energy security is back in, and energy access and affordability continue to be major concerns for many developing countries. Today, approximately 750 million people still lack access to electricity, primarily in Africa. This is, of course, unacceptable. So I think today we will be focusing on questions such as, how do we define energy security in today's age? Does that include climate resilience? Do renewables count as energy secure sources as much as domestic reserves of fossil fuels? Or how about nuclear with imported uranium? With respect to affordability, what are our lowest cost options and how do they differ across the world? And why do they differ across the world? And I'd like to just start by saying a few words about the United States and China, because we don't have any Americans or Chinese on the panel, but I am American and I have spent a lot of my career working in China. And I wanted to set the stage with a couple of comments about those two countries. So last year in the United States, we saw a surge in electricity capacity additions, the biggest surge for many, many years. And of the new electricity capacity additions, 90% of the new capacity was renewables, particularly solar, and battery storage. So very, very strong, largely market-driven choice towards renewables and battery storage. And of that, 40% was in two red states, Texas and Florida. So we are seeing very, very strong change in the electricity market in the United States. Utility scale solar and onshore wind are now cheaper than conventional natural gas combined cycle plants without subsidies. And onshore wind plus storage is now equivalent to conventional natural gas. And I want to hasten to add that the picture and the story in the United States is strongly shaped by the very large resource base that the United States has in natural gas and, of course, in renewable capacity. Turning now briefly to China, very similar story in a weird way, except much more coal. China already has surpassed its 2030 target of 1,200 gigawatts of wind and solar capacity, which is astonishing. They reached this milestone 6 years ahead of schedule. And last year, much like in the United States, renewable energy accounted for 86% of China's new installed capacity, according to new data from the National Energy Administration. So I think I'd like to start the panel with this issue of affordability and the costs of the different energy options that are available to us today, because that is going to influence access and it's also going to influence our energy security choices. So I've talked a little bit about the United States and China. What is the question, what is the situation in Europe, Canada, and India? What are the lowest cost options? And I particularly am hoping we'll get into the question of nuclear, which currently in the United States is the highest cost option, not the least cost, but I know that that's not true everywhere. So let's begin with Stephen Harper, who maybe want to talk to us about the situation in Canada.
Yeah, I can a little bit. Canada's very hard to generalize about because the power systems are run exclusively by provincial governments and usually provincially owned utilities. And they have very, very different power mixes across the country. Look, the one advantage Canada has, regardless of what the power mix is, we are certainly as a whole, not in every region, but we have a surplus supply of virtually every form of energy we could use. So Canada is the one country in the world that should not have energy security issues, although ironically we still import a lot of energy at the same time, but that's got to do with long-term and confident public policy. Look, but the issues have become, as they have become elsewhere with, and we can debate whether it's carbon taxes or renewable mandates or whatever it is. The issue has become that in spite of Canada's incredible energy resource endowment, that energy prices have been rising for consumers almost everywhere and rising quite rapidly. So, as I say, this is going to be, these decisions are going to be made in terms of electricity and other provision on a province-by-province basis, but they're going to be under increasing pressure to deliver lower cost, high reliability. And look, I don't want to talk just about Canada. I mean, the big picture in the world, we should not forget. The big picture is that, I say this as an energy investor, looking forward at energy demand and energy supply, the reality is that even with conservative estimations of energy demand, we are looking at a net global energy shortage if we combine all available sources together. And that really is going to be the world's challenge going forward. The energy demand for growth is just so high.
Okay, I want to come back to the drivers of demand in a little bit, but let me turn to Rafael Mariano Grossi, who may want to talk to us about nuclear.
Well,
but
yes.
Feel free to also give perspectives on this question.
Absolutely, absolutely. It is clear that what we see when we look at the energy markets in the world, that there is a lot of interest in nuclear. Again, this is very obvious here where we are in India. It is even more clear in China. It is quite prevalent in Europe, since you were framing the question in terms of energy security, and a quite clear element of energy security in the interest of especially Central and Eastern European countries on doubling down on the nuclear they had, or accede to nuclear altogether, like the case of Poland, which was the only country in Eastern Europe, but all the others, Slovakia, Slovenia, Czechia, Romania, Bulgaria, all of them, Hungary, all of them with solid nuclear industry. Poland, the only one not having it. The United States going firmly to fleet replacement. Well, Canada, of course, like you were saying, Prime Minister, Ontario, with a green base, basically hydro and nuclear with CANDU, great technology. So what we see is this interest that is there. We also see for the first time in terms of nuclear a demand-driven factor, which has not been the case before, because as it was the case in Canada and in other parts of the world, public utilities or semi-public utilities were driving the effort. Now we see hardly a week passes without a big technology firm signing, an agreement with a company to get an SMR for the data centers. So this is quite a new and very interesting element that we will see shaping also the cost equation that you were mentioning, since you are correct in saying that is not the lowest in terms of costs. Of course, as you know very well, energy costs is a science of great arcane and depending on so many factors, including subsidies, tax structures, and others, which is important. I think from our perspective, what we, from the IEA perspective, this is what we see, enormous drive, interest in nuclear from many countries, including in Africa and in other parts of the world, which with the advent of small modular reactors are looking at this possibility possibility as something which could be affordable for them as well. So it's good time for nuclear. At the same time, there's a need for the industry to deliver. It's not 100% sure that the promise of SMRs will be realized. There is the possibility, yes, but still with some question marks. Clearly, and I think also from a policy perspective, which is very important because policies are what in the final analysis determine so many things, we should be reminded that at COP28 in Dubai, something incredibly unusual happened when the final document said that nuclear energy should be accelerated side by side with renewables. A few years ago, the word nuclear would be taboo, and I'm not joking, would be taboo in a COP conference. Now, the consensus is that it should be accelerated. So, interesting and many aspects to discuss about it, including non-proliferation and others that we may look into it later.
Let me just come back to you really quickly on this question of cost and nuclear. When I teach my students, I always use nuclear as a perfect case of negative learning. In other words, like the opposite of the classic learning curve where, you know, as we have cumulative production increasing, we see unit costs coming down. But in the case of nuclear, at least in the United States and France, we've seen costs rising. Can you talk about what are the drivers of those increased costs? Is it the regulatory environment? Is it the issues that are needed, measures that need to be taken to address proliferation concerns, et cetera, et cetera? And do you have faith that the SMR costs will come down?
Well, it's all of the above. It's all of the above. When you look at the history of energy costs, and in particular nuclear, you will see that there have been times of stability, times where it has been low, and times that, especially after Fukushima, where the safety factor came in very, very strongly, in particular in Europe and in the United States, with a number of retrofitting projects that were stopped and ran into overcosts and huge delays because of that. So those factors were having a big influence. And as you rightly said, in other parts of the world, it's not the case. When you look at China, when you look at India, it is a different story. And when it comes to price formation, also tax structure, subsidies, many things that other sources of energy were benefiting, and rightly so. We are not, I don't take a beauty contest approach to this. We love renewables, and we need more renewables. Nuclear is basically base load. So I think those factors have influenced the fact that international finance institutions for many years have explicit prohibitions. For the first time last year, I went to the World Bank. The Director General of the IEA had never been invited to the World Bank. And I went there, and I was talking to Ajay Banga, and he said, well, why don't we finance? Well, I said, there is some obscure document that has a footnote somewhere that says that nuclear is dangerous. Okay, let's go into it. And then we started asking, never ever had the board of the bank decided on that, but still this permeated to a point where no development bank or regional bank is financing nuclear, and when you ask, they point to the World Bank. So now this is changing, but it's taking a lot of time. So when you take all these things together, plus other societal narratives, then you have a recipe for delay in the best scenario, if not worse. But that is changing. I like to say that there is no nuclear renaissance. There is a return to realism. There is a return to realism.
Could I just add something on
Sure.
this? And look, I'm a big proponent of the need for nuclear to be part of the power mix going forward. But the government of Canada, when I was a leader, had its own nuclear power company. And we had constant cost problems. And two things drove that. One was a tendency to underestimate the longer run cost, to underestimate the constant refit costs, and to also underestimate the costs of the long-term liability management that nuclear creates. I say I'm still a fan of it, but there has been a tendency in most nuclear projects to understate the costs at the front end.
We certainly saw that in the United States with the Vogtle plant, which I think came in 4 times more costly than was anticipated. Okay, Bjorn Lomborg, you are known as a proponent of cost-benefit analysis and low-cost solutions. Can you give us first a perspective from Europe and then your broader perspective on this question of affordability?
Sure. So I think there's 2 things that are incredibly important when you talk about affordability. One actually goes to nuclear. So a lot of countries around the world, and also in Europe, have wanted to decommission nuclear power plants, very clearly, for instance, in Germany. And that's just, there's only one word for that, that's stupid. If you've already built the plant, you've already committed to decommissioning the plant, you've paid for everything, you've paid for all the things that Steve also worries about, and now you basically have CO2-free baseload power that you can just run for another 10, 20, 30 years. Don't decommission nuclear plants. If you build them, use them, and keep using them as long as you possibly can. That's just a no-brainer. So that is definitely one way to get affordability. I think pretty much everyone will probably agree on that. So let me say something that not everybody will agree on. So very clearly, you mentioned that we have a lot more solar and wind. And people love to say that solar and wind is cheaper than fossil fuels, certainly even cheaper than gas power plants. And that's true when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing. That's, we typically use a levelized cost of electricity, which is basically to say, when you can produce a kilowatt hour, how much does it cost? But of course, the problem is most societies don't just want power when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing or whenever it's convenient for whatever power source you have. We actually want it 24/7. And the problem with that is then it becomes a lot more costly. Now, it's very, very hard, and the economic community has struggled with this because the levelized cost of electricity is such a nice and fairly easy way to calculate, but it's dramatically misleading when you compare it across baseload power and non-baseload power. So basically when you compare it with fossil fuels and with renewables. That gives you a very, very wrong impact. If you actually try to look at, so I did that a couple of months ago, we have reasonable estimates for cost of electricity. Remember, there's huge difference between the cost of electricity for consumers and for industries. Almost all countries make a lot of murky decisions on who's going to pay for all that extra stuff. It's not just the fuel cost and the capital cost, but it's also the distributional cost and lots of other costs that go in there. If you just look at the weighted average cost per kilowatt hour and look at how much solar and wind you have, you see a dramatic upward sloping curve. So basically you have lots of cheap countries. Indonesia comes to mind at about 10 cents per kilowatt hour. And then you have the US and you have India at, say, 11, 12 cents. Then you have EU at 20% solar and wind. And we have power cost of about 25 or even 30 cents. And then it goes up. I'm sorry to say my native Denmark comes out at the very, very end. We have about 60% solar and wind, mostly wind, and about 40 cents per kilowatt hour. So if you look at the actual physical impact of what do we charge for electricity and how much solar and wind do we have in the system, it's very clear there's no systems that have lots of solar and wind and low power costs. And that really does speak to this very central question that you asked, affordability. Unfortunately, right now, it is such that hydro is a great thing. If you have it, you should definitely use it. If you have nuclear power, you should definitely keep it on. But otherwise, if you want more power, and most people do because it's the way to get more economic development, you unfortunately right now need fossil fuels.
Okay, let's keep going and get more perspectives on the table. Dr. Chowdhury, do you want to come in, maybe talk a little bit about the situation in India?
Yes, thank you very much. I think there are very interesting viewpoints being put here. See, India, the main thing is that fossils are slowly going out, but not fully, because we still depend a lot on coal. The other source is solar. Solar is caught up in the recent past, and that has really made the prices of the costs have gone down gradually. The solar availability is very regular. It's not seasonal. It is most of the country is blessed with a lot of solar things, and it also gives rise to the use of biomass for the power. And green power is also becoming important because we are blessed with a lot of sunshine, and that's definitely helping us. Now, all these things put together make India a very interesting case for further increase in the power with the help of nuclear is being toyed with. Small nuclear plants are being supported by government now, and hopefully in 5 years' time, we'll see many of those plants coming up. Apart from portability, we also look at the mobility as one of the important aspects, and that mobility comes out of the burning of fuels for running of the automobile or for the transportation. So transportation cost is also being looked at because they also all things add to the climate action. So energy transition and climate actions are becoming very, very critical, and energy transition is taking place in terms of solar, in terms of wind. Wind, of course, has gone quite a lot of it, and now biomass power. So these are the few things which will give rise to more of energy transition, and we will see most of the things are affordable in the range, and they are available around the year. So these are the couple of points which are there peculiar to India. We have to keep this in mind. It's definitely helping for us. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Divyata, can you help us as an investor think a little bit about how the cost of capital is affecting the affordability questions and how that differs across countries where you work?
Thank you, and thanks. Really interesting perspectives. Yeah, it's interesting when you look to see how it is that the energy transition is overall being financed. When you look at who is financing renewable power just in general, 3/4 of it is actually coming from private capital. About 25% of it is coming from state-owned enterprises, and only 1% actually is coming from development finance institutions. And this, we're talking obviously globally. When you look at some of the developing world, it obviously will be a higher representation from some of the development finance institutions relative to some of the other participants. But it is really interesting as just as underscoring the role of private capital in overall in renewable power and in financing the transition. So from an investor perspective, again, I think it's almost like a sort of a three-dimensional matrix of a sort in terms of how one views the different risk curves, if you will. On the one hand, there is the OECD, and then there's the rest of the world, and there's different costs of capital just as it relates to that. There is the question of technology and the maturity of the technologies, so solar and wind and hydro, and there's obviously nuclear, all very established technologies. Nuclear obviously having a much higher in terms of capital intensity and the needs around that. But then there are other technologies that are coming on in terms of how it is that that we should also be utilizing, both from a perspective of minimizing the emissions as well as others where they're lower down in the technology curve, and so they are not being financed perhaps as effectively. And then the third part of it would really be is it brownfield, is it greenfield, is it brownfield? So are they established? Is it going to be new? Do you want to take risk with a new development platform, with a new developer? How is that going to be? It's always that earliest stage that is going to have the highest risk in terms of the financing. And so the role of private capital in here becomes super important. We've talked obviously in the context of nuclear, how some of the off-takers, if you will, are increasingly some of the private institutions, the Googles and some of the other technology institutions, just from a security perspective, where again they are specifically concerned around having that energy security and that access. But what about the rest of the broader consumer market? Who ultimately is responsible for that? Is a broader is a broader question. But we can certainly talk to the fact that there's from a development finance institutions, especially when it comes to, I think, the developing countries. Unfortunately, a lot of it is still governed by debt as opposed to equity, which I think that broadly might make sense, but for the fact that it is not in local currency denominated terms. It's in hard currency. That makes it incredibly difficult for these countries to even be able to finance that. How do you hedge the costs of a hard currency financing? The cost of hedging is incredibly difficult for some of these countries, which are not necessarily going to have a super liquid forward markets and things along those lines. So the challenges still do remain. I do give credit, obviously, where with the World Bank, they're taking a much closer look in terms of some of their own risk ratios, things like that, such that they can actually have more equity available for some of that. I'll pause there.
Okay, I want to slightly change the subject, but it's related, to focus for a minute on energy innovation, which is a subject close to my own heart. I've always said that through energy innovation, we can improve the menu of options available to us in the future, and also, of course, to help reduce costs, right? Improve the performance of technologies and help make them more widely available. I also think of energy innovation as a leading indicator. As if we look at what governments are supporting around the world, we can understand sort of how governments are viewing their futures. And in India, for example, the lion's share of energy RD&D actually goes into nuclear, which I think surprises many people, because that's not the largest proportion of power supply in India. So, just throwing a few technologies on the table, I'd love to get people's reactions to what do you see as forecasts? How much would you weight investments into different technologies? We've talked a little bit about small modular reactors. Fusion is, I think, maybe on the horizon, for the first time. Hydrogen, which is, I think, popular here in the Indian context. Energy storage, and so forth. So who wants to take a run at, how should we be spending our money, and which technologies are you optimistic about?
I don't know about that, but fusion, a word on fusion.
Yeah.
The energy of the future that will always be the energy of the future, as they used to say, is no longer the case. It's very interesting to see that, and of course at the IEA we are working with countries all over the world, including India and others. We have established a fusion energy group, which includes for the first time countries, but also private sector and regulators, because the regulation of fusion is not necessarily the same as fission. So there, what we are seeing is, for the first time, private capital moving into fusion, which is really an interesting phenomenon. We will see how far it goes, but we see oil investors putting money, Eni, for example, in Italy, putting money into fusion. CFS in the United States, as you know, other companies. Germany. In Germany, even at the peak of the, current or past administration, which was very anti-nuclear, determinedly anti-nuclear, they would accept fusion, and there are a few startups, and more than startups, companies that are already working, and it's really interesting, because when you go to CFS or to any of these firms in the United States and some in Europe as well, people will tell you we'll be in the market. We'll be in the market within the next decade. So whether that happens or not, still there are some technological hurdles to be, I would say, overcome, but it's coming closer. So and with great interest from public and private investors as well. On SMRs, it's the issue. I mean, we've discussed that SMRs is everybody has its own project, its own pet SMR project. We'll see how many are in the end are rolled out. But again, what we see is the money is there, the contracts are there, so it's not a matter of if, but when. This is basically what is happening, and the licensing process is one very, very key factor there, which is institutional. It's purely institutional, purely normative, and not technologically driven or capital driven. At the IEA, we are looking at this. We have created a process to try to elicit some convergence among regulators. Nuclear regulators are extremely sovereignists. So there is the idea that you have to leverage what other regulator has licensed is not there yet. We see some groups, Canada, the NRC in the United States, the British regulator, maybe culturally more closer. We see in continental Europe, Finland, France, Czechia. I mean, those regulators are starting to talk to each other. The ideal being, air industry as the model that could be followed. If you don't have a situation, ideally, where you're going to be able to buy a module in the United States to make it operate in Germany without having to go from scratch in terms of licensing, including non-nuclear, because what is incredible is that non-nuclear components, because they were going to go into a nuclear reactor, had to be licensed from scratch. So it is really sort of a catch-22, Gordian knot that needs to be addressed. So this is an area that I wanted to show or to illuminate for the conversation on which we are trying to work, to facilitate the process and move to SMR rollout and fusion as well.
Okay, I think I see 3 people who want to come in. Divyata, you go first, then Bjorn, then Prime Minister Harper.
Thank you. If I may just add on, I absolutely agree. There's a real role for nuclear, I think, in every country's portfolio. Your question, Kelly, just around, really touches on how do you optimize. I think ultimately for the different sources of energy and energy security and access. And I think that what I think we start to see now is just a more thoughtful approach that every country seems to be having around that is optimizing as well for its own resources and its own needs, obviously, but certainly its own resources. So where it is that earlier solar and wind seemed to be a little bit more of a panacea, I think there's a greater recognition that in the countries where the wind blows and the sun shines, that there is going to be a greater reliance on that. And how do you optimize for that? Where it is that isn't the case, you have to be more thoughtful around other sources of energy. Europe in particular becomes interesting in part because they have had nuclear, and I think they're leaning a little bit more and looking much more thoughtfully at that. But at the same time, the sun and the wind aren't necessarily as present as perhaps in other places. And so some of that, thinking about energy security, which now starts to become much more of a point of sensitivity, quite honestly, is also around looking more broadly at neighbors, and the role of Morocco, for instance, becomes interesting in this context where the sun does shine, and how Europe is looking at that particular country and that particular just geolocation as an interesting source of its future energy needs, and the amount of investment that is going in there in terms of solar and increasingly in hydrogen as well, that is then going to be coming across into Europe with undersea see large cables, and ultimately over the course of the next 10 years, really going to be supplying a bulk of the continent's power needs and energy needs. It's absolutely fascinating. On the other hand, you have other countries that are looking very, very much in a divergent way in terms of how it is that they might not necessarily be able to move to the renewable spectrum quite so quickly. And there's the role for a transition. And what is the role of gas in there, which we haven't really touched on in there. The Philippines, for instance, where they have something like 20% of their energy source coming from a singular gas field that is nearing depletion. And they've got China on the back door leaning against them. They are in a very different situation. And so from an investor perspective, they need to open up regulation in a very particular way in terms of bringing in private capital and full foreign direct ownership, which not a lot of other countries do, especially when it comes to something as sensitive as an energy security. So there are many things in the balance here, geolocation being one of them, energy security being another, and others.
Okay, go ahead.
So what she has described is very, very valid and correct. It also gives rise to ultimately number of options. What way you deploy it. Let's take case of hydrogen. You talk about hydrogen. Hydrogen can go for processing. Hydrogen can go for running the vehicle, heavy-duty vehicle. Like that, the number of options are there. Similarly, for biopower, I was referring to biopower because let's take a case of a sugar industry. Sugar industry produces a lot of bagasse, and the entire bagasse can be deployed to produce electricity. And that's most ideal way of putting it. So like that, there are a number of industry-wise geographical benefits are there. There are practical benefits are there. So biopower is equally important. Like that, there are multiple things keep on happening, and how you take a judicious decision, how to deploy what, where. And that will give and affordability will be always the underlying definition for all those things. Reducing the capital cost, because the capital is very, very expensive, that becomes another priority, how you can do it. In that manner, innovation is playing a very important role for reduction of the capital. And all this put together gives you the final model. And that's the way I look at it as an overall picture.
Thank you. Okay, let's go to Bjorn Lomborg next.
Yeah, so Kelly, you're absolutely right. I mean, innovation is crucial. Innovation is crucial in everywhere. So we often accept the idea of saying we fund a lot of research into medical science, just so it produces a lot of Nobel Prizes and a lot of other innovations that will eventually become the things that Pfizer and a lot of other companies will turn into profitable products that will save a lot of lives. This is how it works in all kinds of other sectors. But we dramatically underinvest in energy research and development. We know this. We've done this for a long time. Back in 1980, the world actually invested a lot in innovation because we suddenly realized, oh my goodness, with the second oil embargo, we realized we were up creek and we wanted to find different technologies. We have let that lapse and we've forgotten that the only way we're going to solve future energy challenges, and especially, of course, on climate change, we're not going to solve that by asking everyone, I'm sorry, sir, would you mind being poorer and colder and less comfortable and not be able to fly as much or eat as much meat as you want for the next couple of decades? That's never going to work. What is going to work is innovation. If we can come up with these technologies that will actually be cheaper. And so we need to dramatically invest in innovation. One of the things I think most people don't know is in Paris in 2015, everyone knows that we did this big treaty that we're not actually currently doing. But you know, we promised to do a lot of stuff with cutting carbon emissions. There was a second Paris Agreement at the same event where Obama and many other world leaders and Bill Gates and many other very wealthy people came together in something called Mission Innovation, which was exactly to say we should dramatically ramp up spending on innovation. Because if we could come up with SMRs, so small modular reactors, that would be cheaper than fossil fuels, that would be cheaper than anything else, we wouldn't need to do anything else. Everyone would just switch. If we could come up with hydrogen that was cheaper, I very much doubt it, but let's see. That would be the solution. If we could come up with cheaper energy solutions, everyone would switch. And so this is how technology make a huge difference. If you think back in the 1950s, in Los Angeles, it was a terribly polluted place because of the geography of Los Angeles, mostly from cars. It is simply the fact that cars pollute a lot and Los Angeles caps the whole thing. So it was terrible. It was terrible to grow up there. Everybody was, discussing this. But the solution was not to tell everyone in Los Angeles, I'm sorry, would you mind to walk instead? Because if you know Los Angeles people, I think they're called Los Angelinos or something, they would never accept that. But the solution was a technical solution. We found the catalytic converter. It cost a couple $100, and it basically makes cars not pollute. It's still a little bit, and obviously there's a whole congestion problem as well. But fundamentally, a simple technological solution solved this. This is the same kind of conversation that we need in the energy space. And the beautiful thing, of course, is this is much, much cheaper. So we ran a process of prioritization with cost-benefit analysis on a lot of different things and how to fix climate change. And what we found, we worked with 50 of the world's top climate economists and 3 Nobel laureates. We found that the very best thing to do if you want to fix climate change is to dramatically increase investment in innovation. Because if we can come up with this green innovation, we'll have solved the problem. If we can't, we're stuck in this hard world where there's a lot of trade-offs that most people are unwilling to do.
Prime Minister Harper?
Yeah, look, I absolutely agree. The only way you're going to square the needs of security, reliability, affordability, and environment is really through innovation. It's the only way you're going to do it. So what did we do when we were in government? It might surprise you a bit. We essentially, for lack of a better term, I would say we dabbled in kind of just about the gamut of potential innovations. And I actually think that's the way to do it, because I think when you're dealing with public money, you don't know, you really don't know where innovation is going to go. I mean, look, if you look over, not just in energy, if you look over the last 200 years at kind of futurist predictions, people speculating, we often get right what the general direction of technological innovation is, but we're often very, very wrong on the specifics. And I think when it comes to really investing the big money, that has to start coming from the marketplace. So people who really have confidence that things are gonna pan out. If you start making, especially in the energy sector, which is so linked to every other aspect of economic activity, if you start making big bets on energy innovation and transition that don't work out in terms of affordability, scalability, or reliability, you are really going to screw your economy for a long period of time. So let the big bets be done in the private sector with private money. Now, I just want to say a little bit, one other thing about nuclear. I'm sort of amused in a way over my political lifetime of watching kind of things go in and out of favor, and often how little thought is behind that. And I'm going to use nuclear as an example. Look, it's great that there has been this sudden turn of kind of the environmental folks towards being interested in nuclear, low emissions technology. However, what they forget is that no one has been for a generation or more investing in uranium mining. Even if there is no expansion at all of the nuclear fleet, the world is facing serious constraints in terms of uranium supply within 5 years' time. And it just, to me, just goes to show how little thought goes into these bigger changes.
Okay, I want to make sure we get some questions from the audience. So I'm warning you now that in just a minute, we're gonna take questions. I want to do a lightning round. In other words, like 1-sentence answers each. If you were to pick one intervention, one measure to enhance energy security, and you can put that in a national context, or you can do it as a global, from a global perspective, what would that intervention be? Who wants to go first?
Well, I'll do it. In Canada, it'd be really easy. Build the pipeline system to the east of our country so we can supply our own country with our own energy.
Okay, great.
No ideology when it comes to energy policy.
And unfortunately, if you want energy security, we have it. It's lots of big piles of coal. we should not all do that, but we need to recognize that the current solutions with big storage of energy is actually the most energy secure we have.
I will bet for bio, because it includes
Biofuel.
Biofuel, bioenergy, where you include the farmers and you take the country all across, inclusive. That's the way I look at it.
Thank you. Divyana?
Mobilize more of the revenues and cash flows from the fossils towards other sources of energy.
Okay, thank you, Divyata. Okay, so questions. I see one over here, and I'll work my way across the room. Don't worry. And why don't we take 2 questions at a time, and then we'll do answers. Go ahead.
My name is Krzysztof Zalewski, and I come from Poland. And I'm a child of, in the sense of, the generation of Chernobyl. I very vividly can remember the feeling in my country in 1986. And although I support fully the nuclear energy now, I also remember why a country like Poland withdrew from the project, which was very much, almost operational in the end of 1980s. And here comes my question, because I wanted to ask the question, and firstly, thank you, Director Grossi, for your role in Zaporozhye. I think we need to basically thank you and all of your team for the effort you've made to make Europe a safer place. I don't know if everybody remembers, but 2 years ago it was a very serious crisis around the Zaporozhye nuclear plant, and we moved out of the crisis. But here comes my question. With nuclear power, there is this risk of weaponization of the nuclear power plant, being by state actor or non-state actor. So how can we hedge or against this kind of risks if we are expanding nuclear projects all over the world?
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you. There was a woman in the middle. I think I saw somebody's hand up. No? Okay, in the back. Oh, was that you? Okay, go ahead.
Thank you so much. Very insightful discussion. My question is in context of India. And the way I see it is, India gets a lot of money by taxing fossil fuel. We cannot tax renewable energy in the same way. The revenue that India gets is close to 3.4% of the GDP. And when we are not taxing renewable in the same way, we lose on that revenue. The panel discussed very well that the cost of energy goes up as the energy mix moves towards renewable energy. So finally, it all boils down to the fact that energy transition is necessary, but who will fund it? I mean, it looks like the developed world is not willing to fund it. The multilateral development institutions are also not willing to fund it. So we need to really sort out this thing. Then only any energy transition will happen.
Okay, thank you. So we've got 2 questions. I think maybe Rafael.
The first, yes, thank you very much for your kind words on our work in Zaporizhia. It's not over yet. I always say that we will be able to say mission accomplished when the war ends, and we will have made it without a nuclear accident. But we've been there, and I thank you for recognizing it. It's a very important issue, and I get this question in many places, especially when there's a discussion about SMRs and the possibility of many countries, including developing countries and countries that perhaps do not have the institutional density to have regulators and to have things like that. And I always remind people that this is one of the reasons we collectively created the IEA, so that if you want to have a nuclear reactor, you have to be inspected all the time by the IAEA. And when you look at it, you will see that the proliferators were the ones that left the NPT and that left the IAEA. And when there is a case where there is in doubt, you can think of a country where we are very actively working on, Iran, for example. Then there is a big debate all over the world. There is a lot of focus on what we are doing there. So the price of trying to deviate nuclear material for hostile purposes or military purposes is extremely high. So the thing is, if you are country X, Y, or Z, and if you're planning to have a nuclear reactor, the first thing that you must have is thanks to the NPT, which is the biggest multilateral treaty that exists in international law in terms of membership. Everybody is inside, with the exception of a few, including this country, for the reasons, historical reasons that we know, but it's only a handful. All the others are party to the NPT, and the NPT says, okay, if you want to run a nuclear reactor, then you must have an agreement, and the IAEA inspectors will come regularly to check every gram of uranium or plutonium to see to it that it doesn't go. One important thing, perhaps as a lateral reflection out of the energy thing, but I'm having the opportunity, is that these days we talk about nuclear weapons, we talk about having your own nuclear deterrent is being discussed by many countries which so far are in good standing with their obligations. I think it's very important that we think that we have to protect the nuclear non-proliferation regime. The world will not be better with 20 or 25 countries having nuclear weapons, believe me. Thank you.
Okay, who wants to tackle this question of who will fund the energy transition?
I can start.
Okay.
I have no solution, but let me have a go, and my colleagues can jump in. I think your insight just around India, for instance, and how the economics of it have gone is exactly right. Where solar, for instance, was extremely interesting early on. Especially as it related to subsidies and government subsidies, state subsidies, supporting that. But as things started to get to scale, some of those subsidies started to be withdrawn. Margins themselves started to become less interesting, and now it's reached a very mature phase. That being said, the solar story in India is one of the most successful globally. And it still continues to act real global private sector capital, because there is significant room for growth. And I dare say as well that there are other projects, including, interestingly, hydrogen, which keeps coming up in conversations with most state governments, including in Telangana and Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra, where it is that they are trying to make things extremely interesting in terms of providing the right types of incentive structures such that you can finally get some of these other solutions, technologies, industries to scale. It does still then come back to, as you call it, broadly in terms of the emerging economies, the global south, around who funds this. If the north is not going to be funding it, as the developed nations are not going to be able to fund it, and there is a lot of obviously politics just around that, especially as several developed market economies themselves as well continue to falter in some way. And the role of, again, a blended finance solution becomes critical, and there are complexities to this around how it is that in itself can be structured in terms of who takes, for instance, that first loss, which is ultimately what is necessary for private capital to then start to come in at scale. That's one element of it. So what role can a development finance institution or supranational a government, for instance, take at that first loss, such that private sector capital, which is ultimately a fiduciary to other third parties, and their obligation is absolutely to protect capital, to provide returns to other capital, and we will have, I'm sure, more comments on this. They are held to that standard, and to be able to be I think, as sincere in that mission, they need to be able to protect their capital in order, and you need to have that first loss coming in. The other part of it is really from a regulatory perspective and the governance perspective, where some of these other markets need to bring forward mechanisms such that you do have the right covenant structures and the right protections in place when it comes to ensuring that long-term contracts are honored in the way that they are intended to be, and going in where private sector is going to be able to see the end of the road in terms of their contracts.
Okay, let's take one more comment from the floor, and then I want to get some more questions because I know we have a lot of questions. Go ahead, Bjorn.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So I'm going to make a much shorter answer. The question that you ask, who's going to fund it, shows you that this is going to be costly, and this goes back to the whole affordability issue. You're going to be paying for it, right? You and everybody else in this room. No, not if it's in India, not everyone who's not Indian, but fundamentally, this is going to be regular citizens. And this, of course, is why you won't get a lot of buy-in for this. This is why, Germany did an Energiewende. They wanted to do an energy transition and show the world how amazing it could be. But unfortunately, 15 years later, it's showing the world what not to do. I mean, most people don't look at Germany and say, wow, it's really not very bright here, and they're deindustrializing, but the energy prices are through the roof, and saying, we want to be like that. And so I really think it goes back to the point that we talked about before. You want to have affordability. That's the only way you can get reelected, and that's what most people want. They want to pay a little bit for this, but they're not going to pay for most of it. And you will have to pay for that energy transition. So yeah, it is going to be expensive.
Okay, let's get some more questions.
I'm young energy expert at United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. And presently with my team, I'm working on understanding the just transition that is happening in energy sector all around the world. So I just want to move this conversation from innovation, technology, energy security, economy, little away from all these topics, the social issues that this transition is going to cause. So as the demand of...
Can you get to your question, please?
So as the demand of critical minerals increase, so the issues of mining, displacements, disasters is also going to increase. I was reading the report of IEA, and it was saying that by 2050, the demand of critical minerals is going to be increased by 6-folds. So more the demand, more the mining, more the social issues. So my question is, I have seen there is any policy to resolve these issues at the social issues that are there. Because if our goal is global to achieve this renewable energy, then the policies should be global. So my question is, what is stopping us? Why we are not able to come up with some very strong policy to resolve these issues? And what could be the possible policies to solve these issues?
Okay, thank you. And now in the back. Yeah.
Hi everyone, greetings from Kavya. I work on nuclear technology and policy, and I have a question for Director General Grossi. Considering the recent geopolitical shift in market volatility, what comprehensive measures should be implemented to safeguard the global nuclear supply chain against the potential disruption that may impede long-term energy strategies? And how can multinational partnerships and regional cooperation be leveraged to mitigate nuclear fuel cycle risk, particularly through IAEA-facilitated collaborative framework for countries pursuing expansive nuclear energy goals like India's 2047 nuclear energy goal?
Okay, let's take one last question. In this round, I'll come to you next, and we'll see if we can get a second round in, but I'm not sure what our time is. Quickly, and please, question. No.
Hello?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Sanjay Kumar. I'm from New Delhi. My question is to former Prime Minister of Canada. During his tenure from 2005 to 2016, civil nuclear cooperation happened between India and Canada. Things were moving very good in the direction. A lot of visits were made by the Prime Minister, and strengthening of nuclear relationship was happening. But post 2015, and we come in 2025, the relationship has nosedived. New Prime Minister of Canada has come. How can we strengthen our civil nuclear relationship, specifically when France and Americans are trying to vie the Indian market?
Okay, let's go in reverse order then. If you're ready, Prime Minister Harper. You want to answer?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how to answer the question. Look, we did a nuclear cooperation agreement with India, became a supplier of uranium. I think there's a ongoing negotiation on further supply. I think it's been a productive relationship. I won't comment on the nosedive of the relationship under my successor, other than to say that his own party just removed him, and so we're going to have a new prime minister in due course.
Okay. Raphael?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Well, the question was very pertinent one. I think you put many things into that. Let me say that we have broached them, I think, in general, in the course of the panel, because what you are referring to compound issues that have to do with licensing and regulation. This is one area of cooperation that you were mentioning. We are trying to improve this because we have recognized that 2020 is not 1970, so regulators have to look at the industry in a different way as well, not only in terms of their own cooperation, but also in the relation with the technology. As I was explaining in my last answer, an SMR model is based on a completely different kind of approach to what is being licensed in country A or in country B. Supply chain is the same. You are moving, supposedly, if this is going to work well, into a much more integrated supply chain that is not going to be so locally based as it has been so far, but more spread, I would say. So cooperation is, and then the other factor would be finance, including international finance. It's not through the World Bank that you're going to fund a nuclear power plant, but there are many other things that you can do in terms of viability studies, in terms of design, factibility, feasibility that is indispensable in the earlier phases of any nuclear project that should be financed in this way and is not. So there is a lot of work. What I see, the positive thing that I see is that there is an increasingly global recognition of these factors and the integration of them. So you see that suppliers, vendors, for example, there are not so many. India is moving into that, which is very interesting to see India opening up to private sector also in nuclear, which has been in the past, it hasn't been the case in the past. And we see competitors working together, Westinghouse with the KHNP from Korea, and so on in other places. Of course, now Atkins-Realis, which is the successor of what used to be AECL and the different names that you had in Canada. So different factors, moving into a more integrated global approach to nuclear.
Okay, Bjorn, you want to take the critical minerals
Yes,
question?
just very briefly, I think you're very right in saying that there's a social justice issue and that we should be very careful. You mentioned mining and displacement. And clearly, one of the ways that we solve that is through development. So if you get higher development, you're much more willing to address this. But I think, and that sort of leads back to the circle of the start of this conversation, the biggest social justice issue in the whole energy spectrum is the idea of energy poverty. So if energy is incredibly expensive, and if you're poor, a lot of people are going to have energy poverty. And that is, I think, the vast majority of the big energy justice issue. And I think that's what we've been discussing, and that's really one of the crucial bits that we need to keep our focus on if we're going to supply energy justice to people.
Okay, I'm being told our time is up. I'm really sorry we won't be able to get to the last two questions, but maybe you can catch people on their way out. At the Fletcher School, where I'm the dean, we like to say that reasonable people can disagree, but we've had a remarkable degree of concurrence on this panel. So I want to thank all of our panelists for their thoughtful remarks. Thank you.